Okay, so hello again and welcome to ESG's Research Webcast. My esteemed colleagues, ESG Senior Analysts Lauren Whitehouse and Bob Laliberte, are here with me to discuss today's topic, which is exploring the IT challenges of remote office and branch office locations, which you'll hear us affectionately refer to as ROBOs throughout the presentation. So over the course of today's webcast, Lauren and Bob will be providing an overview of ESG's ROBO survey results. They'll go over the top ROBO IT priorities, challenges, and benefits, as well as talk to networking, security, infrastructure, and data protection in ROBOs. Finally, they'll send you off with some recommendations for the vendors out there on how you can approach and address the ROBO market. So again, if you didn't catch it, we'll be accepting questions during the presentation and we'll address them during the QA session at the end. And of course, any research referenced in today's webcast can be found on our website or in the report. So before I hand the floor over to Lauren and Bob, I'll just give you all a quick overview of where the research came from. The research is based off a recent ESG study that was conducted in April and May of this year. We surveyed 454 IT professionals who are based in their headquarter locations but are responsible for supporting IT requirements at their company's ROBO sites. Survey respondents came from North American mid-market and enterprise organizations. Mid-market would mean 100 to 999 employees. That's about 30% of our sample. And enterprise organizations, which we classify as 1,000 or more employees, they make up the other 70%. Lauren and Bob will talk more about those profiles in a little bit. And the respondents also came from both public and private sector organizations. So the last thing I want to point out before I turn the floor over is our definition of robo that was used in the survey. We've used this standard definition for years. You can read it here. It's also in the report if you want to review it. So with that, here to take you through the rest of the presentation again are ESG Senior Analysts Bob Laliberte and Lauren Whitehouse.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Kristine. So I thought we'd start by giving you just some of our observations of this report and some of the trends and opportunities that we have identified. Basically, what we found is that a lot of the results that we received were basically in line with what we thought they would be. So we saw more organizations looking to centralize applications and services. We looked at them wanting to do that so they could get better control over their environment, be able to lower their costs both from an OpEx and a CapEx perspective. But there were some interesting trends that came out of the research, and so that was some of the things that we'll spend more time talking about. But in general, one of the big things that we saw was ongoing a forecast for greater use of SaaS and cloud. So basically what that was, basically the robos being able to access applications instead of from a centrally located data center, more from a third party or a SaaS. We saw an increase in remote and mobile users as well, right? So everyone knows about consumerization of IT. What this research is starting to show us is that that looks like it's going to be impacting the enterprise in ways that go beyond just the remote and branch office, but actually out to that remote worker as well. Desktop virtualization was another area where we saw a dramatic projected increase in the use of it to help drive efficiencies at the remote and branch office. WAN optimization continues to be play an important role in connecting up these remote and branch offices, and only looks to grow as time continues. And we saw the backup going from more of an edge to being centralized back at the core as well. And of course, continued trend that purchasing and application deployment being centralized back at the main data centers as well. So we also thought it would be good to give you just a kind of a snapshot of what these environments looked like of the organizations that we spoke to. And so you can see the breakdown here where the number one respondent, 32%, had 10 or fewer. The majority, 59%, had 50 remote offices or less. But a fair chunk, 41%, greater than 50 data centers as well. And you can see how that breaks down by mid-market and the enterprise as well. And so probably not surprising, the mid-market, far fewer robo locations, 67% reporting they had 10 or fewer robos, and in the enterprise, 57% reporting that they had 50 or more robo locations. And then when we looked at the IT staff at the robos, shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. Basically, the way this chart breaks down is that it says that if you've got more employees at your robo location, you're probably more likely to have IT staff there. You could also draw the assumption that you're also going to have more IT infrastructure there as well. So when you look at it, what it says, less than 10 employees per robo, 59% of the respondents said they had no IT staff there. When you compare that to more than 50 employees per robo on the bottom, 41% report that they've got IT staff in more than half of those locations. Another 51 saying that they don't have it. They have some, but not in half of them, less than half. All right, so hopefully that gives you a little bit of idea of what the environment looks like and what the IT staff looks like at these locations. And I'm going to turn it over to Lauren, and she's going to cover some of the overall processes and IT priorities that we saw as well.
Great, thanks, Bob. So when it comes to IT standards and purchasing decisions for robo locations, what we took away from this data, as you can see, the overwhelming responses in navy blue represent those that are doing more of a centralized process. So decisions are made at corporate headquarters location and establishing standards, purchasing decisions for application software, and of course, purchasing decisions for third-party services. But what we do see is that there are some instances where there is more of a distributed situation, that is that the decisions are ultimately being made by the actual robo sites. And typically this is where organizations have dedicated on-site IT staff at more than half of their robo locations. They're usually the ones that are given more decision-making autonomy than counterparts where they don't have localized robo resources. So let's dive into the robo IT priorities. So when we asked the respondents about their top priorities for robo locations, about half of the respondents, 48%, identified improving application performance for their end users as a key initiative. So if we look at really those top 3 or 4 things, there's a big theme there around employee-centric processes, including things like improving the accessibility of applications for end users at 38%, and better collaboration capabilities between employees at 36%. That would be the number 4 slot. So, you know, really one of the things too that I think we should call out is the security measures, number 3. So in individual sites of organizations that have specific vulnerabilities, I'm sorry, I'm getting a note saying talk louder. If you guys can't hear me, I apologize, I'll talk louder. So when it comes to information security, either the centralized IT security is going to be perceived to be stronger than the measures in place at those individual sites, or the organizations have uncovered some type of vulnerability at that robo location. I think too, it's good to note, you know, how these robo priorities kind of align with overall data center priorities. And so I'll reference the fact that we did a IT spending survey and published that back in February. And, you know, a lot of the priorities that data centers have overall is really focused around things like server virtualization and managing data growth and information security. I think really the only thing that aligns here are improving backup and recovery, which is actually, you know, at the bottom of this list, or near the bottom of this list when you look at things like improving disaster recovery processes, but that ranks pretty highly in our overall data center survey. So now let's take a look at what's happening with the remote workforce. I thought this was really interesting because I'm sure everyone on the phone probably works one day at home a week. And here what we're showing is that there are a number of organizations that allow their workers to work remotely at least one day per month. Today, that's about 48% of respondents that constitute 10% or less of their knowledge workers. So that's that first navy blue bar there. But if we look at what's expected in the next 3 years, if we add up the first 2 yellow bars from left to right, that's 41% expect that 20% or less of their knowledge workers in the next 3 years will work remotely at least 1 day per month. So a great example of this trend is what's going on with our U.S. government. They're really adopting the concept of telework and technologies that are necessary to support it. This is really something that the federal government believes will address the need for things like flexible work plans, reduction in travel expenses, congestion on the highways, and infrastructure, hopefully all reducing costs. But another reason why this is good is that, this is a decade marked by 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, and so telework is actually an imperative to ensure continuity of operations. So I think this is interesting and something that probably most vendors will not be ignoring in the coming years. So let's take a look now at another interesting statistic. I think the vast majority of robo-related IT decisions are made at corporate headquarters, and we did see that some of those organizations were given, some autonomy around making decisions for their remote location. So this chart is really showing that in the case of IT services and where they're deployed, 3/4 of organizations are currently hosting the majority of their corporate applications or IT services at a central location. But there are some organizations with no robo-based IT headcount, and they're more significantly deploying their applications at the corporate headquarters. So when we look at this chart, I think the key takeaway, and I think, Bob, if you hit down for me, page down, yeah, it kind of highlights it. The paradigm shift that's expected to take place over the next 36 months is that a number of organizations will start to leverage software as a service. So what we're seeing here is that it's actually expected to quadruple over the next 3 years.
Okay.
Bob, maybe you can shed some light on the transition to the cloud from central organizations. Maybe give us some more background as far as how delivering IT services and applications is going to happen, like what the challenges are.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to. So obviously there's a big shift that we're seeing here. Some going to the cloud, but obviously today a majority of people are trying to consolidate their apps from the remote offices into the consolidated data center. And obviously there are some challenges associated with that, with getting those applications and IT services. And probably the predominant one, as we can see at the top of the list, is just poor application performance, right? The response time, that's the number one killer. And it's really also going to be impacted by the geography of those robos, right? The further away they are, there's all sorts of latency that has to be overcome, not to mention all of the network protocols, etc., file sizes that impact that. So you can see their number one criteria and the challenge is getting that application performance, right? The last thing anyone wants is to get those phone calls saying that they can't access their applications or that the application is performing poorly, right? That's followed by the slow file transfer speed. Again, all related to that. The files are getting bigger, images, 3D images, HD video, etc. Everything keeps growing, yet the pipes probably aren't growing all that much. And if they are, it's obviously impacted by the third challenge, which is the cost of that bandwidth. It keeps going up. And again, especially to those remote locations that have difficulty getting available bandwidth, that's going to be even a greater cost. It was interesting, Lauren pointed out earlier from our IT spending that one of the top IT priorities was being able to manage storage growth. And then you see number 4 challenge here is they've just got too much data to move over the WAN. So as organizations continue to generate more and more data, as more and more video gets created, obviously that has to be moved over the WAN. That creates challenges of how do we get there. And again, it directly impacts the bandwidth cost that may have to be incurred. Interesting to see that people are still reporting a lack of available WAN infrastructure and telco services. As you might expect, this would probably be more, not so much in North America per se, except maybe if you're mining sites up in Canada, northern Canada, etc., but in a lot of the third world countries, mining sites, etc., where there may not be any actually telco infrastructure there. Other ones that you typically see, right? Challenges, technical challenges for collaboration, maintaining agents, right? That's obviously difficult. No one wants to do that. Unreliable access, unreliable access for the mobile users and telecommuters again. So we're starting to see things like that move up. As Lauren pointed out, we're starting to see the consumerization of IT have an impact. And so that it's not just robos, but it's robos and those mobile users as well. And obviously, if you don't get it right, as I mentioned, you're definitely going to have dissatisfied users calling your IT. But more than that, what respondents to our survey reported from the business impact of not getting this right was also application downtime was the number 2 response, and the third was, excuse me, the third was dissatisfied customers, right? Which in many cases is far worse than having dissatisfied internal users. So what are organizations doing to overcome some of these challenges? And when we asked the respondents what they responded with, top two responses was that they were buying more infrastructure, getting more network gear, routers and switches, and buying more bandwidth. So I thought that was pretty interesting, right? This is kind of just throwing band-aids at the problem, if you will. However, the number 3 response was, organizations trying to optimize their infrastructure and buying more WAN optimization technologies. So I thought that was a good sign. And when we actually went back and looked at it and did a comparison from 2007 to 2011, what we found looking at the data was the good news is that more people are buying WAN optimization technologies in that time frame from 2007 to 2011. And in that same time frame, even though buying more network gear and buying more bandwidth is still at the top of the list, it's actually come down since 2007. So organizations are definitely getting some benefit by optimizing that network infrastructure, so they don't have to buy as much network gear. They don't have to buy as much bandwidth. The other thing that we're seeing that's interesting around optimizing the infrastructure is the desktop virtualization initiatives. And while the numbers don't show massive deployment of desktop virtualization yet, the future of where they're saying they're going to deploy it looks pretty strong. So a lot of organizations looking at how do I implement desktop virtualization at those remote and branch offices. And also, as Lauren pointed out in the top, ROBO priorities, securing the ROBO is also incredibly important. And so today, organizations are deploying more VPN technologies. They're buying more integrated network and security devices. But to a certain extent, when I have conversations with John Olsick, who's our security analyst, he also points out the fact that that desktop virtualization initiative also helps from a security perspective and being able to control that data that's being accessed from those remote sites as well, and adds a little bit of security also. It should be interesting. It also interesting to note with the WAN optimization technologies that the organizations that had 50 or more locations were twice as likely as those that had 10 or fewer robos to have invested in WAN optimization technology. All right, so you guys as vendors going out, if you're trying to categorize the market and you're selling WAN optimization technology, bigger players, more robos, more likely to purchase that technology. Okay. So what kind of benefits have the organization seen as a result of doing this consolidation and enabling these remote offices? Well, the number 1 response was around their ability to improve their information security by centralizing their applications and data. So that was the number 1 response with 52% of the respondents. A little bit further down the list, but still tied to information security, was the fact that organizations were able to improve their regulatory compliance and any corporate governance as well by consolidating those applications and services and data. Obviously, also again, a big benefit to any organization is the ability to reduce their OPEX and CAPEX spend. Again, tying back to our 2011 IT spending survey, number 1 justification for making any IT purchase was the ability to reduce OPEX. So not surprising to see that trickle down into the remote offices and branch offices as well. And what people were reporting was that the ability to have lower maintenance and upgrade costs by doing all of those locally at the data center instead of having to deploy people remotely was a tremendous benefit. Also, by collapsing that data back, they were also able to reduce their IT infrastructure and also be able to reduce the number of IT headcount that was required at those branch offices as well. So in this case, both OPEX and CAPEX savings. And then also, of course, being able to better protect that data and make it more available. So the third response was their ability, the benefit was they could now back up, have better recovery, and improve disaster recovery. for their remote and branch offices. And also by doing this, they were able to improve their data consistency, availability, and reliability as well.
So Bob, just a comment there. This slide for me really seems like it's very much in line with some of the top IT concerns that, those same themes that we hear about over and over again of reducing risk, cost, and time. I think some of the things that you mentioned here definitely tie into it, but then I know there were some other responses like, easier to perform upgrades and maintenance, which is obviously reflected in lowering OpEx costs and saving time. Is that kind of the takeaway?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's as we look at what's going on today in the data center and in just business in general, it's all about being more agile, being able to respond more quickly to the needs of the business. And so, for those organizations with lots of remote and branch offices, they're an integral part of the organization. In many cases, they're the tip of the spear, right? They're the ones that are closer to the customers and need to be able to respond even more quickly. So a lot of this being able to reduce the OpEx, being able to, lower those maintenance, the time to do the maintenance and so forth, enables the organization to respond more quickly and roll out new applications more quickly to those locations that are in more direct contact with their customers.
Mm-hmm.
That was a great point. Okay. So at this point, what we thought we would do is take you through some of the specific IT challenges for the robo locations, centered around the network, the security area, some of the infrastructure, and also data protection as well. So from a networking perspective, obviously this is a pretty integral part of the equation for consolidating services and applications to remote offices and branch offices. And as you can see, the number one concern around the network is how do we, again, tying back to that performance, how do we make sure the WAN performance is where it should be, right? Are we able to monitor and manage that traffic? And more concisely, how do we identify and prioritize and accelerate specific application on the WAN? So one of the first things I thought of when I saw this was that, the analogy to server virtualization and organizations putting multiple virtual machines on a single physical instance, right? And then having to be able to get the quality of service. Same type of thing. If you've got a lot of applications that you're accessing at that remote and branch office, you want to be able to prioritize which applications get that priority traffic and that priority bandwidth flow so that there's no performance degradation, right? You really don't care if someone downloading the latest version of Angry Birds takes them too long, but you want to make sure that if they're placing an order, they're able to do that. You want to make sure that if you're doing a backup, it gets done on time. So that's some of the areas that people are starting to report. We know we're doing this. We've seen, excuse me, we've seen some great benefits of having these applications consolidated at the data center, but I still have some issues that I need to overcome. One of the other areas, the number 4, latency sensitive apps like video and IP telephony, we're starting to see a lot more around that, specifically even around video and its use and its ability for organizations to be able to multicast those videos, corporate communication. So this isn't so much we're concerned about downloading videos from YouTube, but leveraging video as a business asset and communication asset. And how do we pre-position our video? How do we make sure that multiple users can access it without tying up all the available bandwidth and so forth? Okay. And again, a little bit further down the list, you see some issues around process, the ability to configure remote office networking equipment, wired and wireless networks, and just making sure that WAN availability there. Managing WAN providers, I think, is one of those timeless challenges that you're always going to have. I remember years ago working for a networking company that was always, it took 20 minutes just to get a trouble ticket opened. So that's something that's always going to exist, but hopefully with newer technology, being able to pinpoint those problems faster and pinpoint which providers are going to help overcome some of those. So with all those challenges, it is interesting to see, we thought we'd drill a little bit down and ask some questions around WAN optimization and what benefits those organizations that had deployed WAN optimization, what they saw as an improvement. And obviously the number one response that we got was we're able to deliver better application response times, right? So we saw that in the top challenge, right? The ROBO IT priorities was we need application response time. We saw in the network, we see that WAN optimization actually can help people deliver better application response time again, addressing some of these challenges directly, they're able to transfer files faster and larger files. And also at the same time, right, using deduplication, compression, etc., they're able to reduce the amount of data that's actually transferred as well. It's also interesting to note that WAN optimization, when we did this 4 years ago, was largely a data center to robo kind of play. And so over the years, the technology's improved, and it's also uh, gone to different applications as well. So it's not just data center to robo, it's data center to data center, right? So you get a lot of big pipe. And it's also data center to that remote worker as well. So going down to the mobile laptops, desktops, PCs, Macs, even into smartphones and the touchpads and so forth as well. Another key part about having WAN optimization is obviously to be able to give a better experience to those end users. So having the enhanced reliability, having consistency in how you're delivering those applications, and again, because security is important, being able to secure that data that's in transit. And a net result of having all of these capabilities is really the ability to consolidate more in the data center. So removing more applications from the robo sites back to the data center, being able to bring those services, get rid of the infrastructure that's at those sites, maybe be able to bring back those IT assets that were the IT headcount that's there back into the data center, and deliver just you know, basically a better quality of service to those remote offices and branch offices. From an information security standpoint, we touched upon this a lot, and it was one of the top 3 priorities for them. Um, and we actually also have a brief that we've done on this as well, so you'll be able to find that online. But basically what we're seeing here is that when you've got applications that you're trying to manage over distance, it results in a lack of control and visibility. So it's hard enough to be able to enforce all the security measures and processes and protocols when you have PCs over the LAN, excuse me. But now trying to imagine when you're doing it over to a remote office, right? It's going to be a lot more difficult to be able to configure, to be able to update, and what that's going to lead to is greater vulnerability out at those sites. You can see what's interesting here is that it's not just about, the technology, but also, the number 2 response is about a process, right? The ability or the lack of the ability to train and enforce corporate security and compliance policies for those remote and branch office employees. So, monitoring the use of storage and sensitive data accessed at remote users. And this is where I'd mentioned earlier that from a security standpoint, we're actually seeing desktop virtualization as a potential play to help increase the security out at those remote offices, because by having all that data back at the central location, it's going to be much easier for organizations to monitor the use and see who's accessing that sensitive data than it is in the current setup the way it is right now. Other information security, right? Securing the data at rest, securing it in flight. So if it's traveling between robos, if it's just at the robos, installing and managing the VPNs, etc. So all of those things basically are a lot of the challenges that organizations are facing. But I think again, what we're starting to see is some of the initiatives that they're implementing, like desktop virtualization, etc., will start taking care of some of those issues as well. And I think at this point, what I'm going to do is turn it over to Lauren, and she's going to walk you through some of the infrastructure and data protection challenges.
Great, thanks, Bob. Yeah, so if we take a look at the snapshot of some of the infrastructure, respondents were asked to provide, things like their server count at their typical robo location. And what we found is that about 2/3, 62% of organizations average 5 physical servers or fewer at each of their local locations. And then when it came to things like server virtualization, what is the use of server virtualization technology at those locations? About half, 53% of organizations are currently deploying it to some extent, and another 17% report implementation plans in place. And I think that's pretty much in parallel with what we see in the data center. I think the numbers are a little bit higher in the data center, but I think that's very encouraging to see that server virtualization is making its way out of the data center and into the robos. Obviously, one of the big benefits of using server virtualization includes things like the reduction in server hardware and improvement of resource utilization, improvement of disaster recovery capabilities, and reducing floor space requirements. So it's actually a perfect fit for remote and branch offices where, staff resources, floor space comes at a premium, and, things like disaster recovery is something that is just as critical at the robo location as it is in the data center. When we look at desktop virtualization, it's often a fast follower to server virtualization. And here what we see is that the survey reveals that 25% of organizations are currently leveraging that technology, while another 42% plan to over the next 12 to 24 months. So I think, again, to some of the points that Bob was making earlier, having that central image maintained in the data center and then delivering that image to remote and branch offices and remote workers can do a lot for improving the end user experience, improving security, and hopefully making it a lot easier for IT organizations to manage all of those endpoints. And it's probably why 42% plan to do it in the next 12 to 24 months. When we take a look at storage, storage capacity is just another useful metric in kind of sizing where the IT environment is at that robo location. And when we asked how much storage capacity is actually deployed at a typical robo, about 2/3 of the respondents reported that they average about 5 terabytes or less per site. But there were also some on the higher side that were reporting significantly more storage. 39% stated that they would have less than a terabyte. So I think to Bob's point earlier, there's all of these challenges as data growth kind of kicks in, where it's more stuff to manage out of those endpoints, and if you're moving data between sites, that's going to impact WAN optimization. Your decision probably to invest in WAN optimization. But for a lot of organizations, it's probably not a critical situation. And then if we look at the, sorry, just lost my place. If we look at what kind of storage these sites are implementing, I think it was interesting to see that most organizations were using internal server storage, 23%. There wasn't a big distinction between really the top storage responses. NAS was at 22%, Fiber Channel SAN at 20%, DAS at 19%, and iSCSI SAN at 14%. So if we look at those particular responses with kind of a storage capacity lens, we'll find that those organizations that have less than a terabyte of storage capacity per robo were more likely to be leveraging internal storage as their storage strategy, 4 times more likely than those with, say, 25 terabytes of capacity. And the tendency to leverage those more well-established network storage technologies like NAS and SAN were significantly higher among organizations averaging more than 25 terabytes per robo location. So I think that's pretty much in line with what we would expect. So now let's take a look at the storage challenges that the robos might be experiencing. So what this is showing is that about 1/3 of the respondents definitely have difficulty keeping pace with data growth. 27% feel as their backup and recovery processes are insufficient. This is very much in line with what we see overall in the data center. Managing data growth and improving backup and recovery processes tend to be kind of the perennial favorites when it comes to storage pain points. Cost is clearly a consideration when you're thinking about what type of storage strategy you're going to have for your robo location. So of course things like storage system cost is ranking highly here, 24%. Insufficient capital budget, 18%. Power and cooling costs, 11%. That's all kind of factoring into the pain points. And I think we're seeing a recovery in the economy as far as IT budget pressures that has eased a little bit, but cost reduction still remains a really high business initiative for most organizations, and that would include out at the edge of the remote and branch office. I think it's also worthy to note that the number 4 position highlights the need for information security. So I think that's just a consistent theme here, especially because data at the remote and branch office is, outside the confines of that headquarters firewall and sometimes can be at risk. And when we specifically asked about it with respect to storage, it's definitely a pressing storage challenge. Okay, so let's move on to some of the backup stuff. Tried to simplify the responses on this one because there was a lot of text associated with it. Basically, I'm noting disk to disk as the process of moving from a production system to a disk-based backup architecture. Disk to tape would be I move it to disk as a landing zone, but eventually the data will go to tape. Disk to WAN to disk is that situation where I'm backing up to disk at the remote site and I'm transferring it over the WAN to another disk target. Oftentimes we see this with virtual tape libraries and intelligent backup targets with deduplication, where you might mirror the data between devices. Disk to cloud is a situation where I have a local copy and I'm vaulting a copy to a third-party cloud resource. So, a lot of vendors are kind of introducing these cloud gateways for their products and allowing some portion of their data to be retained in the cloud. And then the disk to WAN to disk would be a situation where I don't have any local copy. I'm going right from my production system to the corporate headquarters. So that's that concept of a centralized backup. And then disk to cloud is a typical software as a service implementation where I'm going right from production system storage to the cloud. And I'm typically doing that through a backup software as a service. So, there's obviously lots of methods, but as you can see, predominantly people are doing a disk to tape or a disk to disk type of implementation. About 52% of the organizations do that. And that's within best practices of having that local copy plus the offsite copy. That 11% that's only doing a local copy, that's somewhat risky because if anything happens at that remote and branch office site, then they don't have a plan B. And I think what's really kind of the big takeaway here is that 26% of those respondents that have no local copy. So they're completely reliant on that centralized copy in the headquarters to protect that site. And when we compare the information that we collected in our 2007 branch office optimization report, that number has actually quadrupled. It was about 7% back in 2007, and now we're up at 26%. That trend is likely fueled by things like WAN optimization technology that has made it a lot easier to transfer data over distance. So obviously deduplication fits into that category and has played a big role in data protection over the last couple of years. Okay, so then another thing that I thought was really interesting was just to look at the trending data of the type of media that's being used on premises for backup purposes. And so here what we're showing is that the blue bars represent the 2007 data and the yellow bars represent the most current 2011 data. Disk-based backup has, pretty much doubled over the last 4 years, going from 14% of organizations in 2007 to 32% in 2011. And, that's something that I think I would expect, but these numbers are actually much more dramatic than what we see in the data center. Backing up directly to tape is definitely fallen off, but I don't think by the margins that it has as we see here. And then interestingly, a lot of people are still using a combination of disk and tape. I think the big takeaway, though, when you're talking about tape is that rather than have tape at the edge in multiple locations, if organizations have compliance or retention requirements requiring them to move data to tape. What they're doing is that they're consolidating. They're, going disk to disk and then, bringing that into the data center in a disk to disk to disk fashion, and then cutting tapes from that central location. And that allows them to consolidate the tape infrastructure and resources, and obviously drive down the costs associated with managing tape. It's also obviously going to increase reliability of backups for a lot of those organizations. Okay, so let's move on to looking at those organizations that are backing up data directly over the WAN to a centralized corporate site as their primary remote and branch office data protection strategy. So here what we're seeing is that about 2/3 plan to do so at some point, and 40% expect this change to occur within the next 2 years. So today it's only 20%, but it's picking up a lot of steam with almost half of the respondents saying, yeah, that's the direction that we want to take. That might have to do with some of the trends that we see around deduplication. That might have to do with security issues. I think one of the things that is interesting is that when we look at what the pros and cons of doing something like this are, you don't have that local copy out at the edge. And that's something for an organization to weigh as they get to a decision point about implementing something like this. If they only have a copy at the data center, how long will it take for them to recover a whole server or a whole site should something disastrous happen? I think for a lot of organizations, it's probably easier for them to load up a portable NAS device and put it on a plane than to stream it over a WAN connection, much like what we see in backup software as a service situations. Okay, let's go on to why this stuff is so appealing, why moving it to the central headquarters as the strategy for backup is so appealing. So, I mentioned concerns about security as the top reason why you might want to centralize the data. I think in the past when we were moving stuff around on tape from edge to core, you were often dependent, especially if there's no IT resources out at the remote and branch office site, often dependent on non-IT workers to be responsible for packing up those tapes and putting into a FedEx or somehow, getting it to the headquarters. And, there was a lot of sort of headline grabbing news about lost tapes and the vulnerabilities that were introduced by doing that. So when you're electronically transferring that data, and it can be encrypted, and there's IT involved in that process, remotely managing the situation and obviously maintaining the chain of custody with that data, I think it significantly reduces the security issues. I think, too, that the other thing is that there's not a lot of IT people out at the edge, as we saw from some of the previous slides in the webcast here. And if there are people out at the edge, they typically have IT generalist skill sets, or lower skill sets than what you might find in the data center. And so that could contribute to concerns about the remote and branch office staff's ability to actually make sure that those backup jobs get done, ensure regulatory compliance. And again, this is all about reducing risk for an organization, and they don't want to have any gaps in their risk. So they might not want to take that chance of having anything go wrong out at the edge. Okay, so then let's take a look at some of the challenges with doing that centralized backup. So I know earlier we talked about some of the WAN bandwidth as a challenge, and I think it was about 1/3 of the organizations identified that as a challenge overall. So it's not surprising to see that 40% of respondents here are looking at WAN bandwidth as the cost of it as a particular issue and a hindrance to doing remote backup from edge to core. WAN bandwidth is also an important factor when it comes to recovery operations. So, I was just talking about if you have a whole site or a whole system that you have to recover, is it really going to make sense for you to have all of your data outside of that local location? But I think there are a lot of workarounds that people are figuring out, based on the availability of, third-party overnight shipping to get data out, and it's typically going to take less bandwidth and less time if you do it in that fashion. The other thing, too, is that I found it really surprising that 31% of organizations stated that they haven't experienced any challenges backing up robo data over the WAN. So either they don't have a lot of data, or they've got sufficient bandwidth. Maybe there's a low change rate down at those remote and branch offices, or they've implemented a solid disk-to-disk strategy with deduplication, where they've kind of solved a lot of those headaches that we mentioned earlier. All right, let's go to the next slide, and I'm going to hand it over to Bob to wrap things up.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Lauren. Well, I think what we wanted to do is provide, all of our IT vendor clients who are on this webinar some recommendations, some things that we took away from after going through this research. What would we give? What kind of advice would we give to you in your daily activities? And so, some of them, again, are going to be what you would expect. Others, hopefully, might be some new and innovative ways for you to look at the market. But, starting at the top, basically that the fact, and Lauren had mentioned this earlier, the opportunity for the robos is largely found in centralized purchasing and in that corporate data center and headquarter location, right? So you're not going to be spending a lot of time calling on the robo locations to be able to sell your products and services when most of the decisions are being made back at corporate. I think one of the big takeaways for us with looking at the data was the ability to message and prepare for the SaaS growth that we saw in a third party, i.e. cloud, that would be connecting directly to those branch offices. So for us, I think this means that, if you're a service provider yourself, then that's great. You've got an opportunity to target these remote and branch offices right through the corporate headquarters to say, you don't want to deal with backing these up, especially if the WAN bandwidth is too expensive. You can connect to our services right over the internet, or excuse me. Or it could mean that if you're not currently working with service providers, it's an opportunity to go and work with those service providers to be able to deliver your services from the SaaS or cloud down to the remote and branch offices, i.e., WAN optimization delivered as a service instead of an end-to-end enterprise play. We also see that consumerization of IT is driving more and more use of mobile devices, and so this is something that we believe is something you really need to embrace because it's not going away. It's only getting more prolific, and so you need to extend your support down to not only just the laptop, right, and PC, but also down to the smartphones, to the iPads, the tablet PCs, etc., as they become more prolific in the workplace. And so that could be everything from making sure you can accelerate traffic to them, to making sure if the data is stored locally that it is backed up and secured, etc. Right? Authentication, all those types of areas that need to be addressed by that proliferation of those devices. Also, desktop virtualization was one of those things that we saw as really increasing in the remote and branch office, and a lot of good reasons to do that. You can reduce your CapEx, OpEx, going to be more secure. So we see that as a trend moving forward, that if you're not already seeing it, you should start to see it at these remote and branch offices as well. From a WAN optimization perspective, it's kind of look at this and joke, right? It's not just for breakfast anymore. It's being used everywhere. So data center to data center, data center to robo. And again, because of that consumerization of IT, I would actually expect this to see it extend down to the remote worker, remote user on a variety of different devices and handhelds and so forth. I think it's also important to note that the ROI for a lot of these WAN optimization technologies is improving as well, because you're just going from the hardware appliances to virtual appliances. So making it more affordable for more widespread use and adoption throughout the entire enterprise. And then lastly, as Lauren was talking about, really you need to expect that there's going to be less backup data at the edge, and more of it's going to be centralized either to a data center or potentially to a third party, excuse me, or to a cloud environment. So, that pretty much wraps up the webinar, some of our takeaways and recommendations. We hope you found it useful, and I think at this time we're going to turn it back to Kristine and open it up for questions.
Yep, so thanks, Bob. Thanks, Lauren. We have a few minutes left to go over some of the questions that we've gotten in. If you have one that you have been itching to ask but haven't gotten it down yet, feel free to send that in. We'll get to it if we can. I guess I'll just jump right in. One person asked, I see that backup redesign has gone way down since last year. Why is that? Is it because they've all redesigned their backups to use dedupe?
So I will take that one. I don't know that backup redesign has necessarily gone down. That's not what I'm actually experiencing when I talk to end users. I think that there was a big focus around trying to fix the data growth problem in the backup process, how to fit my backups within the window and how to accelerate recoveries. And the insertion of disk in the backup process really helped that. That was the low-hanging fruit that all of the dedupe vendors and VTL vendors kind of attacked. However, that's not the only thing that can be optimized in the backup process. And I think when you're talking about server virtualization as a catalyst event, and that's going on right now for most organizations, including, as we've seen out at the ROBO, there's still going to be redesign of backup that's going on. The focus, however, is probably shifting more to the front end of the process. In other words, how do I capture data more efficiently and store it on disk? And so I think that there are implications there for the target system vendors, for backup storage, because data might be coming at them in a different way than what they're used to receiving it. So I think there's more to come there.
Okay, thanks, Lauren. Another question here. What applications do organizations want to be delivered by SaaS or cloud?
All right, I'll take that one, Lauren.
Yep.
So basically what we saw in the report, and this shouldn't be too much of a surprise, but the top responses when after obviously seeing that dramatic increase, we wanted to know, what was the preferred method for which applications. And the top responses for applications delivered by SaaS or cloud revolved around email and CRM, customer relationship management software. And then there was also some reporting HR and security software as well that they wanted to be delivered as a service. So I think that's pretty much in line with what we've seen. We did a research report earlier in the year around cloud computing, and I think that pretty well lines up with the reports that we got there, and it's pretty consistent. So if you're looking to deliver applications to the robos via SaaS, you might want to start with email and CRM.
Okay.
Yeah, and actually, if I could just piggyback that, Bob, with a comment. I think one of the interesting things is that, oftentimes when vendors in the data protection space think about software as a service, they're thinking about it as a new consumption model for backup and recovery. And I think as organizations start adopting software as a service for things like CRM and email, there's going to be less data that has to be backed up by the traditional, in-house software. Now that you're outsourcing those applications, the data is being hosted somewhere else. And you've also outsourced the responsibility of any data protection or availability mechanisms to that third-party provider. So as SaaS kind of takes off, it could alleviate some of the burden on, the amount of backup data that has to happen, and obviously would impact the backup window and stuff. So this is a trend that I think is going to have some, sweeping impact on data protection as we move forward, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens.
Okay, thanks, Lauren. Thanks, Bob. We have time for a couple more. Do you think that it's WAN optimization or deduplication that's responsible for more centralized backup?
Oh, I'll take that one. So deduplication is actually a component of WAN optimization. And if you look at, Riverbed's technology as a great example of WAN optimization, the algorithms that they're using to reduce the footprint or capacity of data over a WAN connection is very similar to what is happening in backup with deduplication. So I think that there's definitely more deduplication available in both backup software and target devices that are replicating between sites, and that probably has a big impact on why there's a lot of centralization of backup and such. But then, of course, WAN optimization is going to help with everything else outside of backup. I don't think there's a lot of benefits of combining WAN optimization with deduplicated data. So you're not going to see the combination there. WAN optimization would probably be more so for things outside of the backup category.
Okay, and hey, Lauren, someone was asking a question around, there's so many dedupe products, and is there any specific underlying technology that makes dedupes, one dedupe methodology stronger for a robo than another?
I don't think so. I think, all of the vendors that have introduced deduplication as a feature of their storage system or their backup application do an equally well job of maximizing that bandwidth and storage. There are obviously nuances with each approach or algorithm that's being deployed. I think one of the things that potentially, when you have multiple remote and branch offices sort of fanning into a central data center, that disk to over the WAN disk strategy, then you're going to have a level of global deduplication, which is going to drive even higher efficiency, and that would be consistent across both software-based approaches and hardware-based approaches. So, I don't really think that there's anything significant that kind of comes to mind with one solution or approach versus another.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. What were some of the most notable changes from the 2007 study to the current study? I think, Bob, you had mentioned we had done one earlier.
Yes, that's correct. So I'll start, and then Lauren, you can jump in. I think for me, one of the, focusing on the network areas and the security area was seeing the increase in users deploying the WAN optimization technologies. I had mentioned in the conclusion, right, we're seeing it not just to remote offices, but also extending out to that remote employee as well. So seeing that shift in how enterprises are able to get productivity from their workers and so forth, seeing that shift from just being an internal, either centrally located or remote office located, and going to more of a home worker, knowledge worker approach, and how the industry is changing to accommodate that, I think that's a big change that we've seen in the last few years, right? So overall, I guess you could group that under consumerization of IT and the impact that that's having on overall IT and what we're doing in the branch office as well. For me, it was interesting and great to see that more people were deploying WAN optimization technology. I believe that's something that just should be pretty much universally deployed, especially as the costs are coming down, virtual appliances and so forth, to be able to optimize that costly WAN bandwidth just makes a lot of sense. And, I think I mentioned earlier in the presentation that, the results that we saw between the 2007-2011 report was that as people bought more WAN optimization, we saw a decrease in those that were buying more network gear and a decrease in those that were buying more WAN bandwidth. So obviously having its impact, doing its job, and enabling people to get more value from those links. Lauren?
Yeah, and I called out that I think the two big takeaways in comparing the data from 2007 to 2011. Number one, significantly less use of tape at the edge. And number two, a lot more centralization of backup at the corporate headquarters. Those were the two big blips that I saw in the research.
Okay, so I think we're out of time. I want to thank everyone for participating, and thank you, Lauren and Bob, for all the analysis and commentary. Playback will be made available both on our website as well as in a follow-up email for this webcast. So we tried to get through as many questions as we could. If we weren't able to get to yours during the QA session, we will be following up with you using the email that you provided upon registration. So thanks again to everyone.